Hey Arcs. Today we're going to talk about a whole bunch of information that came out about the Waker class, which is coming in August for New Genesis. This information comes from the ARCS Expo 2022 that happened in Tokyo, Japan. This showed off a whole bunch of things for the Waker class, including class skills, the different PAs, and the pets slash familiars, including a whole bunch more as well. So I created a presentation for you guys, kind of consolidating all of this information into one spot so you don't have to kind of scour all over. Well, let's actually get into it. All right, here we have the ARCS Expo Waker Close Look presentation by myself, of course. Before we get into this, though, I have a few disclaimers. A lot of these sources were in Japanese, and because of that, had to be translated into English, so some of it might be a little bit iffy or spotty, as I don't really know any Japanese myself. And then for the second disclaimer, a lot of this information can change when Waker actually releases, so just be aware of that. So, first off, we're going to talk about the differences between Waker here and Summoner from base game. So on the left-hand side here, we have Waker, and then right-hand side here, we have all the Summoner things. So for both of them, they use the weapon type Tact, or the Harmonizer as it's known globally, and that is the only weapon that they have. Just be aware that you can multi-weapon with this in NGS, and just like with both, you can use subclass weapons. But then beyond that, basically everything else is differences. The first off is the pet system. So with Summoner, you used to have a whole bunch of different pets that you would kind of attach to your Harmonizer, and they would have their own kind of PAs and attacks and whatnot. But with Waker, you have Familia, which you have all of this Familia all at the same time, and these are kind of like your different PAs where you shoot them out and they fight for each of their actions. And then with the pet system, you could like nurture them, or you could upgrade them with different items and put things in their candy box, level them up, have elements, etc. While with this Waker, you're not going to have any of that. You're basically just going to be upgrading your Harmonizer instead. And then with Summoner as well, you could use techniques, while with Waker, you cannot. I'm not sure about what this law attack attribute thing is, but I think what they mean here is that the pet could attack independently or something here, but I'm not quite sure. Maybe somebody else could tell me that point. But then with normal attacks, they are fixed point attacks, kind of like how Gizon is as a technique, where it just kind of hits if the target is in line of sight. And then with the pets, they usually had varying attacks just kind of all over. But if I was to say what these two classes kind of represent, Summoner would be kind of like a Pokemon trainer or Pokemon master, while Waker is more of like a stand user from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. But moving on to the Waker's stands, or quote unquote familia, we have three different types here that Waker will start off with. First off is Fredrin, the second is Wolfer, and the third one is Meru Mero. So these kind of represent pets from base game or ones from Summoner. So for the first one with Fredrin, it kind of is the same as Redrin, the dragon type that shot a whole bunch of ranged attacks. That's going to be playing similarly there. And then with Wolfer here, I guess like the closest thing is Synchro, which was kind of like the melee kind of gap closer pet. And then for the Meru Meru, some of you already kind of guess, is the combination of Marin and Melon from base game. But getting deeper into these three familiars, they each have two different PAs, except for the Meru here, which has the weapon action with long press and the normal press. So with Fredrin here, they do range attacks, and with the first PA, they kind of shoot multiple people just like regular bullets, and with a long chase though, they kind of lock onto different things and chase against multiple enemies. With the PA2 here, this is a riding ability. If you just press it normally, it's like a multi-stage hits with bullets, but if you long press it, you actually hop onto Fredrin and ride it around, and then when you release it, does a big explosion at the end. And then with Wolfer, that is like the melee or close range attack. Basically with this first PA, this is a whole bunch of AoE, with a shockwave for normal, and then with a long press, you kind of like attack around with a perimeter. With the second PA, this is like a gap closer or kind of chaser. So with the normal, you rush forward and do like an upper, and then with the long press, it does a continuous attack after a rush. And then with the Meru, the weapon action is basically the Waker's guard. If you just guard in time, you can actually get stages, which is something later on that I'll mention. And basically, if you just guard one time, you get stage 1. If you do it 3 times, you get stage 2. But basically, with this gauge, you can do a long press and throw this Meru to do a whole big explosion. But that's it for the familiars for now. We're actually going to move on into Waker's class skills. There's actually a whole slew of them, as you can see here, a couple active skills, a whole bunch of different things for Harmonizer, and the different pets and whatnot. But it's actually been translated by Altia here, where they go through each of these different class skills. We're going to go through this one by one. This first page here is the main class skills and Harmonizer skills, or tact skills. Some of these are going to have changes in the next slide, but we'll kind of just go through them here. So this is tact gear or harmonizer gear, which enables the familiar gear gauge. There's also familiar unison, which takes advantage of this, or it's an active skill where it consumes 2 of the gear gauge points and performs a powerful attack. And then next up we have Marmello Strike or Meru Strike, where it builds a charge by guarding attacks, and then releases the charge power by pressing and holding weapon action. So this is that weapon action stuff that we saw a couple slides ago. And then there's the strike training with this thing, where Marmello strikes automatically pursuing enemies. And then there's treble clef marking, which when you attack foes to mark them, the marked enemies receive additional damage from the tact PAs or harmonizer PAs. And then treble clef ignition, activated when attacking a marked enemy with a normal attack. Basically, you hold down the normal attack, and it basically activates an explosion. And then with familiar assist, your familiar will appear to produce a follow-up attack that builds familiar gear when activating treble clef ignition. So basically a follow-up to this previous skill. And then there's an amplify for this, where it increases the amount of familiar gear that you gain off of this. And then next up we have Hot Marmello Parry. This is the other active skill, where Marmello automatically appears to block attacks even while you're attacking. And then there's a short recast for this as well, where it reduces the cooldown of this parry if you're struck by an unblockable attack. So this is very, very useful, so you can keep attacking and not having to worry about blocking during this. So this could also be useful if this could apply to multi-weapons as well, but we are unsure about that one. And then we have the tact parry counter, where when you press the normal attack after successfully just guarding an attack, you can perform a counter attack. And then there's a PP gain with this as well, where you recover PP upon successfully just guarding an attack. And then there's a thing called linear drive, where you perform a normal attack with proper timing after using a PA to perform a retreating attack. And then there's one more for the linear drive, where you can input it a second time in a row after performing linear drive. You kind of do it back to back. And then there's a call again PP save, where it reduces the PP consumption of familiar PAs while your familiar gear gauge is 0. Then this next slide, we have the Waker skills that can be used by subclasses. And then there's an alteration to some of the translations for some of the previous skills. So first off, we have the Old Friends Rescue, where it's properly translated here, where it's a chance to automatically recover HP when receiving damage equal to or greater than a certain percentage of your maximum HP. And then we have Welfare Management, which reduces damage taken and increases rest assign HP recovery, while HP is below a certain percentage of maximum HP. So 2 very good skills to not take as much damage and increase your healing or auto heal in some way. And then there's also a Resta effect continuance, where you can continuously regenerate HP over a limited time after using a Resta sign as well. So a whole bunch of extra healing and damage reduction. And then at this last thing, you have a chance to not consume a Resta sign or a reverse assign when you're using those things. So this might be a good subclass pairing where you main Force or Tector, where you have the Resta Fields skill, and you can kind of apply some of these to yourself and maybe even to others. I'm not sure about how this works, but if you're trying to be the proper healer, this lucky sign might come into effect more often than you would think. So you can keep healing others, and it would be insanely useful if it procced in, say, Geometric Labyrinth, where you have those modifiers that reduce how many of these you actually kind of have. Or, if you just want to pair it with Hunter as well, you could just be the tankiest thing in probably the whole game. But moving on to these alterations here, we went through the first one, but here there's Treble Clef Marking, where attack foes with familiar sufficient times to inflict a mark, and then the marked enemies receive additional damage. The difference here is just you have to hit them several times. But the ignition, that's the hold normal attack thing, but you also restore photon power when you detonate these marks. And then with the familiar assist, after inflicting a triple clef mark with a familiar PA, detonating the mark summons a miniature familiar, kind of like a little shield beside you. And it deals extra damage with additional attacks, kind of like little bullets that shoot out, and these also build familiar gear. And then with the linear drive, the kind of difference here is that you can actually choose the direction forwards or backwards depending on your input to travel instead of it just being like a retreating attack. Then up next, we have a look at what these skills would look like on your subpalette or weapon bar. All of these are in yellow, so this means this is a technique class. Scales off of that alone with the harmonizer. And as you can see here, this is where the several different PAs come into effect. So this is the Wolfer ones. These are like Fredrin, and then there's the Marrow Mellow right there. And then as you see here, there's the two active skills with the familiar assist and the Marrow skill to automatically block attacks. And on the next page, this is where it kind of shows that familiar gauge system we've been talking about. So there's actually a separate one for each of your familiars. So Fredrin's here, Wolfer's there, and the Marrow is here. So with the Marrow, it's like little individual charges off of the Just Guard system. And then here, these are actually like gauges, kind of like photon blasts, where you expend these for these super like attacks or with the active skill. So these other panels kind of just show off some of these attacks, like where you throw the Marrow with the weapon action, the two spending gauge thing here with those two familiars, just an assortment of attacks. But moving on to another thing here that K66OP kind of mentions, translated from Japanese, you can actually use this gauge system when it's at gauge 1, but it actually kind of does less damage. Around 700, they're using like a Evil Coat tact plus 40, and then with the second one, it consumes 2 of the gauge, and it did like around 3,000. Granted, it was against a weakness, while this other one was a non-weakness. So I would say it's probably about like 3 times the damage versus just using a single gauge to 2 gauge. Then finally we have a video actually on all of the new Waker stuff from the Expo. Might be a little bit low quality here, but should basically get the job done. Alright, so here's kind of the start of part 1 here. This is some of the stuff that we already saw in the headline. Kind of showing off the Waker outfit itself. Some of the attacks with the different marks, as you can see there. That's them applying it by doing several attacks. So yeah, there's the 3 different familiars. Alright, here's some of the actual new stuff, where they show up the normal attacks here, where you can see it's on the point, right on top of them. It's kind of like them just guarding. Then we're going to see some of the ranged attacks here with Fredrin. And then there's some of the melee. There's Fredrin hitting all of those enemies in like a cone. Lots of multi-hit cone attacks with Fredrin here. And then kind of like an all-around, almost like a homing dart. And here is where you ride on him and do a big blast at the end, kind of throwing it at the enemy. Alright, so then here's Wolfer. doing some of the ground pound or shockwave attacks. This is kind of like some up close and personal. It looks like it leaves like an AoE as well. And you can charge its attacks like with the long pressing. And then there is the gap closer that I mentioned before. Very good for getting in close. And there's kind of the long press version of this where you kind of do continuous attacks by holding it down. And then here we have the photon blast. Pretty powerful. This is where they kind of show off the gauge abilities for this. Kind of building that up where you use the different PAs for each of the monsters here or familiars. And there's the combination attack where you use the gauge. Yeah, you can use it with just one on the gauge. And then here they show off the Meru one, where you're just guarding to get those charges on that. And then you can toss the thing right at them, just kind of nuking them for big damage. And there they're showing off the counter attack, where you can do an extra little attack after you're just guarding. So here they show off exploding these marks on the enemies. And this is where they get those little sigils on the side too. And here's the automatic blocking. Looks like it doesn't last for too long, but it has like a 10-second kind of cooldown as well. So not too bad. I just spam that as much as possible. Yeah, this is a much more active class than Summoner was. Kind of getting right up in the fight instead of just like being in the background, kind of tossing your pets around. That's pretty much it for that video. It's a pretty good summary of all of the things that Waker can do once it releases. But kind of just this last panel here, this is kind of like summing everything up. Basically, hit attacks between Fredrin and Wolfer to accumulate these markers on the enemies and increase your gear gauge for each of the different familiars. And then when you do have these markers attached, you can explode them to get extra photon power and do a whole bunch of damage that way. And then while you're intermingling these attacks, make sure to block attacks with the Maru Mellow. And you can also counter attack with this thing and also throw it if you're doing the just guards correctly. A whole bunch of damage that way as well. And then once you do your gear accumulation, you can either do it at the 1 charge or the 2 charge, but it seems like the 2 charge is way better, so you probably want to save for that one if you can, and just do a whole bunch of damage that way too. And then with linear drive, you can kind of go from melee to medium range, even long range with Fredrin. But yeah, this is an incredibly versatile class. You got the melee, the range, the countering. The only thing you don't really have is techniques, which is kind of weird for a technique class, but it is what it is. But yeah, I'd love to play this in game when it finally releases, and I can't wait to see what people kind of come up with the subclasses, the multi-weaponing, etc. But here on this final slide is just some of the sources from all these previous things, and I'll be linking this presentation in the description down below as well. So if you guys want to take another look at it for yourselves, you can do that too. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this format, this presentation, which I haven't done one in forever. But yeah, if you guys haven't subscribed yet already, please consider doing so, because these do take a lot of work, kind of compiling all this separate information together in one spot. But I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.